All right, welcome back to Unit 6, Video 3. We're going to continue on with the era of good feelings and then get into Andrew Jackson a bit. So, let me get on the right slide here. Sorry. So last time we left off with the Battle of New Orleans and the Treaty of Ghent and how it was a better deal for the Americans. Now we're going to get into James Monroe. So the Virginia dynasty of presidents continued in 1816 when Secretary of State James Monroe was elected to succeed James Madison. So are you guys catching the Virginia dynasty comment? The first five presidents of the United States, barring Adams, John Adams, um, were all from the state of Virginia. So James Monroe included. So Monroe maintained the dominance of the Jeffersonian philosophy into the 1820s. His quiet, modest manner pleased and impressed even the staunchest anti-Jeffersonians. Um, so popular, or well, more like just so unobjectable was Monroe that in the election for his second term in 1820, he came within bec- one electoral vote of becoming the only president besides Washington to be elected unanimously. He was only one vote away. The president's popularity and the collapse of all political opposition to the Republicans caused Monroe's two terms to be known as the era of good feelings. So, why is it called that? Well, we see the collapse of the Federalist Party, so no one's really party oriented. And then we're going to see that he mends fences with the British on the Canadian border. We also see that we gain some land. We get Florida from Spain, and then we'll look into the Monroe Doctrine. So let's start with mending fences with Britain. The Treaty of Ghent stopped fighting with Britain, but it didn't settle the problem between the two nations. The United States and Great Britain, therefore, carried out extensive negotiations to settle their differences. One of the first and most important of these agreements was the Rush-Bagot Treaty, and that limited the number of American and British warships in the Great Lakes. And its provisions were eventually extended along the entire U.S.-Canadian border as the nations advanced westward. So the United States and Canada have maintained peaceful relations for 2 centuries with no fortifications. Barbed wire or large armies between them, none of that's ever been used. In 1818, the United States and Britain agreed to occupy the Oregon Territory on the Pacific Ocean jointly until they could decide how to divide it. Then, let's talk about Florida. So we're mending fences with the British, and in Florida, some members of Congress, especially the War Hawks, had hoped that the War of 1812 would result in the conquest of Florida. So even though Spain owned the area, it exercised very little control over it. It was known for anarchy and chaos. Pirates, escaped slaves, and anyone who wanted to get away from problems, they lived in Florida. But they also used it as and pirates and stuff, they used it as a haven to make raids across the U.S. border. So when violence occurred between Indians and settlers in Georgia, the American government authorized General Andrew Jackson to punish the Native Americans in a swift campaign. He also arrested 2 British citizens who were accused of aiding the Indians. After very questionable and speedy trials, Old Hickory, as was his nickname, had one hanged and one shot. Then Jackson's army captured Pensacola, which at the time was the capital of the Spanish Florida. Now, at this point, Jackson's actions have exceeded his orders, and the government was certainly not interested in offending the British again. But Jackson's campaign was enormously popular in the United States. To the U.S. government's relief, The British were not interested in going to war over a couple of obscure Indian traders. And the Spanish were understandably angry, but Secretary of State John Quincy Adams decided to take a firm stand with the Spanish government. Jackson, he said, was only defending American lives and property. Adam argued the Spanish could do a better job of policing their territory. Jackson's campaign showed Spain how helpless it would be if the United States found sufficient excuse to take Florida. So rather than risking losing a war, the Spanish government decided to sell the entire region. So under the provisions of the Adams-Onis Treaty, the U.S. gained Florida in 1821 at a cost of $5 million. We bought the whole state of Florida. Now, the United States possessed all territory south of Canada and east of the Mississippi River, as well as its holdings in the Louisiana Territory. Woo! So, all sorts of great progress is made on the land front during the era of good feelings. So let's talk about the Monroe Doctrine. This is something that you need to know. It is core to Americans' foreign diplomacy. So the impact of Napoleon's conquering armies and ideas was not limited to Europe. When Napoleon conquered Spain and Portugal, the Spanish and Portuguese possessions in Latin America leaped at the chance to be free. They had been led by a revolutionary leader, Simón Bolívar and José de San Martin, and most of the Latin America countries broke from their European overlords and founded independent republics. After the fall of Napoleon, Spain began to look longingly at its former colonies, and the other powers of Europe indicated their willingness to help crush the dangerous revolutionary republics. One exception to this mood of reconquest was Great Britain. The British had established a profitable trade with the new nations and had no desire to see them become Spanish colonies again. So the British government asked the United States if it would join Britain in proclaiming that European powers should not intervene in the Americas. And President Monroe and Secretary of State Adams considered the offer. They decided that rather than tying America to Britain, the nation should issue its own warning. And in 1823, during his annual message to Congress, President Monroe declared that, this is a quote, "The American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers." So, end quote. Furthermore, he added, still part of the quote, "In the wars of European powers in matters relating to themselves, we have never taken any part, nor does it conform with our policy to do so." And that is the Monroe Doctrine. As Monroe's statement of policy came to be called, the United States established two principles here. Make sure you know these two principles. Write them in your notes. Sorry, I lost my place. Number one, European nations could not intervene in the Western Hemisphere. The caveat was, except where they already had colonies. So European nations could not intervene in the Western Hemisphere. And the second thing, the United States would not meddle in European affairs. So when issued, the statement was little more than a paper pledge, since the United States lacked the military might to back it up currently. But the Monroe Doctrine would become a cornerstone of American foreign policy. And since 1823, numerous presidents and statesmen have defended its principles and expanded on its meaning. It affects the manner in which the United States conducts foreign policy even today. It embodies one of the cherished tenets of Jeffersonianism, and it also solidified one result of the War of 1812. It formalized America's determination to remain isolated from Europe and its affairs. At the time, that proved wise. In the 20th century, Americans found such detachment increasingly difficult to maintain. As Monroe's term of office and his era of good feelings drew to a close, the nation confronted serious internal problems and important internal developments. The young nation directed its energies towards expanding and developing the frontier, harnessing new technologies, and grappling with the problem of slavery, all of which would test the character of the American government. The era of good feelings and the Jeffersonianism in general ended with threatening clouds of conflict on the horizon. And now we are moving in to the age of Jackson. So, although the period from 1820 to 1840 is often named for Andrew Jackson, it was actually well under its way before Jackson's 1829 inauguration. Since the beginning of the century, powerful cross currents were tossing the political and social seas. Jackson would ride into office on its turbulent crest, but the age was shaped by forces much larger than any one man. Widespread currents of nationalism, sectionalism, and democratization originated before Jackson's presidency as they would shape America's future long after Old Hickory was gone. So, let's get into the Jackson years. The Democratic movement that won Jackson the presidency was underway before Old Hickory became its popular hero. By joining the movement, Jackson brought his fame to the national political stage. So remember, we've seen Jackson now in two different stages already. We know that he was the one who led the Battle of New Orleans, and we also know that he was there when Florida is purchased by the United States. And now he's running for office. Also, right before the election that Jackson won, it was the first time that you didn't have to own land to vote. So it's still only white male men, but the fact that they didn't have to own land to vote was the first big suffrage movement in the United States. Anytime you hear suffrage, it's the right to vote. So the first big right to vote movement was in this election, and Andrew Jackson was the result of that election. So Jackson brought his fame to the national political stage when he ran for office. His remarkable life supplied more than enough material for his hero image. By 1828, Jackson's biography read like a brief history of the United States. He was born in the Carolina backcountry in 1767. His parents were Scot-Irish who had left Europe just 2 years before their son was born. Frontier life was challenging and dangerous. His father died in an accident while clearing his fields for spring planting. And 3 weeks later, his grieving widow gave birth to a third son, giving him the name of her dead husband. Young Andrew's early life was rugged and difficult. At 13, he joined the Patriot forces against the invading British, serving as a messenger. In April 1781, Andrew and his brother Robert were captured by the British cavalry. When one of the officers ordered Andrew to clean his boots, Jackson refused. The enraged officer slashed the boy on his head with a sword and hacked at his raised arm. Jackson would bear the scars of his defiance for the remainder of his life. Ooh. After the war, Jackson studied law in North Carolina and he was admitted to the bar. The young lawyer soon became a public prosecutor in Tennessee. The opening West well suited the fiery, energetic Jackson, and he acquired land, slaves, horses, and a taste for politics. Jackson became a state judge and in 1796 was elected to a term in Congress, where he gained some respect for his straightforward thought, some and sometimes harsh manner. Jackson's reputation, however, was not made in Washington. It was forged on the frontier, fighting Indians and redcoats. General Jackson drove his men hard, but he drove himself harder. His grit earned him the admiration of his ranks, and he's tough as hickory, they would say, and so he was, and that's why he has that nickname, Old Hickory, because hickory wood is so hard. But Jackson displayed many flaws in the years before he won the presidency. During the War of 1812, he ignored a treaty that had been negotiated with the Creek Indians. He confiscated huge portions of their land, even from those Creeks who aided him in his conflict. He led soldiers into Florida, then controlled by the Spanish. There he exceeded his orders and nearly caused a war with Spain. He was brutal in his treatment of the Seminole Indians in Florida. And in 1824, former President Jefferson said, "I feel much alarmed at the prospect of seeing General Jackson become president. He is one of the most unfit men I know of for such a place. He has had very little respect for laws or constitutions, though he is an able military chief." So we're already starting to see the two sides of Jackson, right? He is very proactive and energetic and tough and strives for excellence in some ways, but in other ways, his moral compass is very flawed and he leans towards the cruel. He's sometimes known as the people's president. Jackson's partisan victory for the people ushered in a change in the filling of government jobs. The new president believed that public service should not be a lifelong career. Until this time, bureaucratic officials such as clerks and postmasters and tax collectors and court officers were appointed to serve on a fairly permanent basis. Jackson held that men who stayed in public office for too long were prone to corrupt their own power. Accordingly, after reasonable intervals, particularly with the change of administrations, rotations in office should occur. He actually took a very low-key approach to replacing officers, even though this is what he verbalized. During his first year in office, he turned out only 9% of the appointed office holders he had inherited, and then less than 20% in the second term. Today, that number is significantly higher. The significance of Jackson's replacement of government officials was not so much that what he did as what he started. This spoils system, giving government jobs to political supporters, would endure for half a century. So it's all about political loyalty instead of a person's capabilities. So we're not considering the person's merit, like are they actually capable for the job? It's are you loyal to the party? So while it is true that Jackson's policy did shake up an entrenched bureaucracy, it also removed some highly qualified individuals from office at times and replaced them with highly unqualified individuals. Neither did the spoils system necessarily make public servants more responsive to the public, since the bureaucrats owed their job to the party leaders, not the people. So, spoils system is a rough system. Um, it was not necessarily the best implementation that the government needed. So let's talk about the kitchen cabinet. Jackson's cabinet members were given their posts as political rewards for service rendered during the campaign rather than their merit. But they actually had little influence with the president. Jackson's real advisors were a close circle of friends that critics called his kitchen cabinet. It included newspaper editors, dominant Democrats in Congress, and his Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren. So, all political insiders. Increasingly, the president was taking on the role of party leader. Almost from the outset, Jackson's administration was torn by infighting, particularly the jockeying for power between Martin Van Buren and Vice President Calhoun. Van Buren increasingly sought the favor of President Jackson in an effort to limit Calhoun's influence. In addition, the sectional differences between the New Yorker and the South Carolinian heightened the dispute, particularly over the tariff question. Calhoun, who had been a very strong nationalist in the War of 1812, was becoming the major spokesman for the interests in the South. So, what is nullification? This is when states can reject congressional acts they deemed unconstitutional. And there is a constitutional question here. Does the Constitution allow for nullification? People like Calhoun, the vice president, they believed that it did. And there were others who said, no, that's not the case. Now, this had been brought up once before, just the idea of nullification. And now we're going to see it kind of come into full-fledged support as the Civil War happens. So let's talk about the nullification crisis. So at the time of Jackson's inauguration, the tariff controversy was raging again. Tariffs, remember, are taxes. In 1828, Congress passed a new higher protective tariff, a tax on international goods, with rates of up to 50% on some imports. The more industrialized North welcomed the tariffs because it protected their businesses, while the South called them the tariff of abominations. Um, Southern leaders recognized the constitutional right of Congress to levy some tariffs to raise revenue. That's in Article 1, Section 8. However, they considered tariffs aimed at protecting a particular class or favoring one section of the country over another to be unconstitutional. The North favored high protective tariffs to curb competing foreign imports. The South, though, depended on foreign imports in exchange for its agricultural exports. So higher tariffs meant high prices in the South and higher sales of northern goods. Revenue the government received from the tariffs, therefore, came largely from the South, but was mostly spent to fund internal improvements in the North. So, in short, Southerners viewed the high tariff as a discriminatory tax. And in December 1828, the South Carolina legislature officially declared the new tariff unconstitutional. It further suggested, as had Jefferson and Madison in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, that any unconstitutional federal act could be nullified or declared invalid by the states. So Georgia then declared the tariff unconstitutional and nullified it. And then Mississippi and Virginia did the same 2 months later. So the issue of nullification was drawn from an anti-tariff pamphlet published anonymously by Vice President Calhoun. So the South Carolinian proposed the doctrine of nullification, whereby states could nullify or reject congressional acts they deemed unconstitutional. Congress then could either change the law or send it to the states as a constitutional amendment to be ratified or rejected. So nullification was Vice President Calhoun's attempt to find a constitutional middle ground between submission and succession. Succession, remember, is withdrawing from the country. Nullification raised both tempers and constitutional questions in Congress. And in a celebrated debate in January 1830, Senator Robert Hayne, a gifted speaker from South Carolina, rebuked New England's opposition to succession as inconsistent since it had considered succession itself in a different convention. Daniel Webster, a senator from Massachusetts and perhaps America's finest speaker or orator, defended New England in his response to Hayne. He insisted that the people of the United States as a whole, not as individual states, had ratified the Constitution. Webster declared it is the people's constitution, the people's government, made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. Therefore, he said, a state could neither succeed nor nullify an act. Webster's speech climaxed with the famous phrase, liberty and union, now and forever one and inseparable. His views, however, like those of others involved in the controversy, appeared inconsistent, and in 1815 he too had supported the Hartford Convention decision to succeed if Congress denied its demands. So opponents charged that Webster was seeking only what was best for his state or his region. This nullification issue is going to smolder for years, and it will eventually come into the Civil War. But this is where it kind of gets introduced and fleshed out, and um, the two arguments develop. I think we might be done for the day. Let me just see what's ahead. So, yeah, we'll be all set for today. We're leaving off with nullification and the tariff of abomination. And yes, that is the Daniel Webster who wrote the first dictionary in the United States. All right, guys, I hope you have a great day. I will see you later.